On the morning of August 31st, 2001, a couple in the city of Puyallup, Washington, called local police and requested a welfare check. Their nanny, 36-year-old Dana Laskowksi, had failed to show up that day, and multiple attempts to reach her had gone unanswered. While this might not have been a cause for concern for some people, for Dana, this was extremely troubling. She had never even been late before, let alone the type to skip out on work entirely without so much as a phone call. By the time police were sent out to Dana's residence, it was about 11 a.m. Close to 3 hours had now passed since she was expected at her job, and still, no one had seen or heard from her. When knocks at Dana's front door likewise went unanswered, an officer walked around the property to perform a quick inspection. It didn't take long to find something suspicious. The 36-year-old's back door was partially open. The officer entered and walked through the kitchen. The home was completely silent as he started to check the place one room at a time. He continued this until he got to the living room, where he spotted what appeared to be a woman lying on the couch. She was covered with a pillow and blanket, and for a second, it almost looked like she was sleeping. That was, until the officer got a closer look. It was then that he called for detectives. While it quickly became clear that police had uncovered a crime scene, piecing together the details of what had happened, and more importantly, why, would be far from straightforward. As it turned out, finding suspects would be no problem. Finding answers, though, was another thing entirely. And little did investigators know, this tangled path led to a truth more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. From the time that she was a child, Dana Laskowski was known for two things: her creativity and the way that she always cared for other people. She had a happy childhood and developed an artistic streak early on, something that was nurtured by her father, Bill Ross, who was himself an award-winning artist. The father and daughter's mutual love of art formed a strong bond between them. Dana was always interested in what her dad was doing, and he loved nothing more than having her help in whatever way she could. As Dana got a little older, her natural inclination to care for others only grew. She started babysitting as soon as she was able to, and at some point began to dream of one day owning a daycare. More than anything, though, she couldn't wait to have children of her own. In 1989, at the age of 24, Dana met a man named Sam. The two fell in love and married quickly, but almost immediately they encountered difficulties. In a cruel twist of fate, Dana had trouble getting pregnant, and it seemed like she might never be able to have the family she dreamed of. After 4 long years of fertility treatments, however, Dana finally got her wish. She was even more delighted when she found out that she would be having triplets. Though raising 3 young children at the same time wasn't easy, for Dana, it was the greatest joy of her life. In 1996, she was even interviewed as part of a local newspaper article when she took part in an annual picnic gathering organized for the families of triplets. In the article, she talked about some of the everyday challenges she experienced, recounting a recent trip to the grocery store. She had meticulously prepared for the outing, gotten the triplets fed and ready ahead of time, only to realize once she arrived at the actual store that she had forgotten to dress herself. She said that she was a bit embarrassed doing the shopping in her flannel pajamas, but there was absolutely no way she was going all the way back to the house at that point just to get changed and get all 3 toddlers in and out of their car seats again. Honestly, who could blame her? While motherhood was full of wonderful, albeit occasionally exhausting surprises for Dana, unfortunately, the same couldn't be said for her marriage. In 2000, after 11 years, she and Sam decided to split up. She ended up moving about a 3-hour drive away to the city of Puyallup, Washington. Understandably, life for a single mother of triplets was an even bigger challenge than anything Dana had faced up until this point. Nonetheless, she seemed to thrive. She got a job as a nanny and worked hard to provide the best life she could for her children. Even with her plate so full, there was seemingly always more room for love in Dana's life, though. She became like a second mother to her 17-year-old niece Amanda, who struggled with drugs and had a contentious relationship with her parents, but who was always welcomed into Dana's home. Whether she needed a shower, some food or money, somewhere to wash her clothes, or simply a place to stay for the night, Dana was always there. At times, she even lent a hand to Amanda's friends as well. It was for all these reasons, Dana's kindness, her dependability, and her devotion to those she cared for in her life, that everyone was stunned on the morning of August 31st, when a heartbreaking discovery was made at her home. When Dana failed to show up for work that summer morning, the couple that she worked for almost immediately became concerned. They knew that she wasn't the kind of person to no-show, and when repeated attempts to contact her were unsuccessful, they notified police. It would turn out that the couple had good reason to worry. When an officer arrived to conduct a welfare check at Dana's residence, he received no answer at the front door. The door was locked, so he walked around the property, discovering that a back entrance had been left ajar. He entered and began walking through the house until he made his way into the living room. It was here that he saw a woman lying face down on a couch. For a moment, it looked like the woman could have been asleep. However, a closer look quickly revealed that this was not the case. Her body position was extremely unnatural. One arm was underneath her head, while the other looked like it had been pulled behind her back. Her waist was twisted at an awkward angle, and there were abrasions to her neck, elbows, and knees. There was a small pool of blood in and around her mouth, and she wasn't breathing. Based on the description the officer had been given before carrying out the welfare check, he knew that this was Dana Laskowski. Sadly, she was dead. When investigators arrived at the scene, they began processing the house for evidence. The place appeared as though it had been ransacked, almost as if someone had been searching for something inside. In the basement, detectives found a window that was broken. It was relatively small, but was still a good enough size that someone could have squeezed through. In the living room, investigators noticed what appeared to be a blood trail or some spatter on the floor. Based on Dana's injuries and the location of the blood, it seemed to suggest that there had been a struggle. An autopsy would soon confirm this theory. It not only revealed that Dana had died of strangulation, but that the attack had been vicious. A great deal of damage had been done to her throat during the assault, and the killer had fractured the hyoid bone in her neck. The autopsy report estimated Dana's time of death to be somewhere between midnight and 7 a.m. on the day that she was found. Detectives concluded that whoever was responsible for the terrible crime must have been quite strong. Based on the extent of Dana's injuries, they further speculated that the killer might have committed the murder while in a rage. While the ransacking of Dana's house seemed to indicate that burglary could have been a motive, the brutality of her death seemed to indicate that the killing itself was personal. Unfortunately for detectives, little other evidence was found at the crime scene. Authorities still held out hope that fingerprints, hairs, or DNA might be recovered, but in the meantime, they needed to expand their investigation. They needed to speak to those that knew Dana in order to get a better idea of who in her life might have been capable of committing such a heinous crime. As it turned out, detectives wouldn't have to probe far before multiple people of interest were revealed. Still, there was one more pressing concern, though. Where were Dana's 3 young children? When Dana's family members were notified about her murder, they were understandably heartbroken. The blow was made even worse by the fact that it didn't seem to make any sense. Everyone loved Dana, her family told investigators. How could someone who had devoted her life to caring for others be so suddenly and callously taken away from them? However, there was one person who was notably absent during these early conversations with detectives: Dana's ex-husband, Sam. After the murder, authorities tried to get in contact with him, but they couldn't find him. This was even more concerning because, as police learned, Sam was the one who was supposed to be taking care of he and Dana's triplets at the time. The uncertainty lasted for several days, until finally Sam contacted detectives himself. When he did, he said he was just as surprised as everyone else, and that he had no idea what was going on. Sam explained that he and his children were perfectly safe and fine, They had just been on a camping trip for the last few days. During that time, he hadn't had access to a phone, so that's why he hadn't been reachable. He had arrived back home to an avalanche of confusing and disturbing messages about Dana's murder. While Sam's story seemed to make sense, investigators were still keen to speak to him in person. As Dana's ex-husband, he was immediately at the top of their list of people of interest in the case. During a subsequent interview, detectives asked Sam about his and Dana's relationship, trying to suss out a possible motive. Sam said that yes, they were estranged, and they did have their fair share of arguments, but they had only come out of a more than decade-long marriage about a year earlier. There were obviously still unresolved issues between them, not the least of which being how far away Dana had chosen to move when they separated. Sam felt that she had basically split up the family. That being said, though, Sam stated that they were working on things, and they were trying to co-parent as best they could. He said that he had nothing to do with the murder. Investigators weren't totally convinced, however. When they asked Sam to provide fingerprints and DNA samples, he was uncooperative. He stated that it was because he didn't like the idea that he was a suspect. Detectives, meanwhile, saw it as suspicious. When asked about his activities on the night of Dana's murder, Sam said that he was getting ready for the camping trip, which he and the triplets had left for the following morning. He provided a receipt for gas near his home that night that checked out, but even so, authorities felt they couldn't eliminate him as a suspect completely. Because Sam didn't have an alibi for the complete window during which Dana was estimated to have died, detectives theorized that he technically could have made the 3-hour trip to her house, carried out the attack, and then still made it back in time that morning to take his children on the camping trip. Sam certainly would have been strong enough to commit the crime, and due to the strained nature of his relationship with Dana, investigators speculated that he likely had motive as well. However, absent any actual evidence, this was all simply conjecture. Frustratingly, none of Dana's other family members seemed to have any better leads for detectives to go on. Authorities had hoped that her niece Amanda might have some information, since she spent more time with Dana than almost anyone aside from her children, but she said that she had no idea who could have done something like this. It wasn't hard to see that she had been hit especially hard by Dana's murder. With her aunt gone, she had lost the biggest constant in her life, the one person she could turn to when she had nobody else. Fortunately, it wasn't long before another tip sent the case in a new direction. The information came from the couple that Dana had worked for as a nanny. It turned out that there was another reason that they had been quick to call police when she failed to show up for work on August 31st. Prior to her death, Dana had been dealing with a stalker. The couple explained that Dana had confided in them that there was a man named Patrick who had been harassing her. Patrick installed cable in the area, and after meeting Dana, had tried to contact her for over a month straight. When Dana tried to politely turn down Patrick's advances, things only became more alarming. He started leaving notes and flowers on her back porch. The notes started out as love poems, but when Dana ignored them, they took a chilling turn. The content of the notes became threatening and began to include details that Patrick could have only known if he was sitting outside of Dana's home and watching her for hours at a time. The couple told detectives that Dana was terrified by what was happening but didn't know what to do. Chillingly, she had gone as far as to say that if anything were to happen to her, Patrick would be the one responsible. When authorities looked further into this lead, they were disturbed by what they found. Dana's phone records confirmed that Patrick had been repeatedly calling her. They also learned that Patrick drove a white van for work. Neighbors of Dana's had recalled seeing a similar vehicle in the area prior to her murder. At one point, a white van had even been spotted in the alleyway behind her house. These unsettling details were enough for detectives to obtain a search warrant, which was served at Patrick's residence in early September. Upon encountering him, police found Patrick combative and uncooperative, something that raised their suspicions of him even further. However, when Patrick was brought in for questioning, the case took yet another unexpected turn. When detectives informed him about Dana's murder, his demeanor changed instantly. Rather than being angry or scared, Patrick seemed genuinely stunned. Almost immediately, he offered up his fingerprints and DNA to be compared against evidence at the crime scene, and said that he had no involvement or knowledge of anything that had happened. As proof, Patrick told detectives that he had been working on the night of the murder and that afterwards he had hung out with some friends. To their surprise, when authorities looked into the alibi, it checked out. Not only that, they would soon learn that Patrick's white van was not the one that had been spotted in the area around the time of the crime. No sooner had investigators gotten this news that they learned that there was another potential suspect they needed to look into. The man's name was Michael. Michael worked in the film industry in Vancouver, British Columbia, and had met Dana when she was in Canada visiting a friend. The two of them formed an instant emotional connection, and despite living hours apart on opposite sides of the border, began dating. Like with many long-distance relationships, though, Dana and Michael had eventually run into problems. It was hard not being able to see each other for long periods of time, and there were also aspects of Michael's life that Dana struggled with. He was a big partier and would often use drugs to excess, something Dana disapproved of. At one point, she had broken the relationship off, but by the time of her murder, they were trying to make things work again. There was one more thing that authorities were interested in, though. While asking questions about the relationship, they learned that Dana had had a one-night stand while dating Michael. They speculated that perhaps jealousy had pushed Michael over the edge. However, when police interviewed Michael, he said that he knew about the one-night stand and had moved on. He was extremely emotional upon hearing of Dana's murder, denying any involvement and saying that she was the love of his life. In fact, Michael said that he would have been with Dana at the time of the crime if he hadn't been stopped. He went on to explain that on the night of the murder, he had been on the phone with Dana. During their conversation, he had felt like something was off, to the point where he had decided to make an impromptu trip to see her. He hopped in his car and made it as far as the border, but wasn't allowed to cross. He was turned away due to ongoing legal issues he was dealing with. Detectives looked this up and discovered that Michael was telling the truth. Border records showed that he had indeed tried to cross into the United States, but hadn't been allowed in. He was nowhere near the crime scene when Dana was murdered. Following the interview with Michael, investigators felt that they had officially hit a dead end. They had now gone through 3 suspects: Dana's ex-husband, her new boyfriend, and her stalker, all of whom initially seemed like solid leads that detectives would have expected to go somewhere in any traditional murder investigation. However, as authorities were now beginning to understand, this case was far from typical, and if they wanted to find answers, they were going to have to try a new approach. After finding their investigation at a standstill, detectives moved away from the quote-unquote obvious suspects and started searching for anything they might have overlooked. It was during this time that one of them had an idea. What about the book being kept with Dana's ashes? The book in question was one that had been placed next to where Dana's ashes had been inurned, and had been there since her funeral. It was meant for friends and family to sign and leave messages in, but authorities now thought that it might also contain vital clues, especially if, as they still believed, Dana's killer had been someone that was close to her. Sure enough, while scouring the pages of the book, one entry stood out. It was from Amanda. The message stated that she was sorry that she wasn't a better niece and that she had let her down, and that she was now going on more than a month clean and sober. While the message was definitely one of grief, detectives also felt like there might be something else underneath. To them, that something looked a lot like guilt. When investigators sat down with Amanda for a second interview, she began by stating once again that she didn't know anything about what had happened to Dana. However, by this time detectives had done a lot more digging into her background, particularly into the people that the 17-year-old spent her time with. Authorities learned that Amanda hung out with a rough crowd of friends. The group frequently got into trouble for things like drug and alcohol use, and were known for hanging around a local park in the center of the city at all hours of the day and night. This had spawned the derisive nickname which they were known by, the park rats. Unlike many people who had judged or been afraid of interacting with these young people, Dana Laskowski was her usual nurturing self around them. Just like her niece, she had even welcomed some of them into her home. After revealing that they knew all of this, detectives asked Amanda if there was anyone in particular in her circle of friends who she thought might have been capable of the crime. Finally, she gave an answer. She said yes, there was one guy, Blaine. Amanda said she was suspicious of Blaine because he had once attacked her when she had rejected his romantic advances. She was worried something similar could have happened with her aunt, and moreover, claimed that she had actually seen Blaine not far from Dana's house on the morning her body was discovered. Disturbingly, she said, at the time, Blaine had scratch marks on his arms. Needless to say, police were intrigued by this information and started looking deeper into Blaine as a suspect. They quickly discovered that he had a lengthy criminal record that included drug and gun charges and began to think that they might have their man. The only problem was that Blaine had since left the state of Washington and was now on the complete opposite side of the country. He refused to come in for an interview, so authorities began looking into having him legally extradited. In the meantime, detectives continued to ask around about Blaine and managed to track down a friend of his that was in jail that agreed to talk with them. Just when they sensed that they were getting close to an answer, though, this friend dropped a major bombshell on them. Blaine didn't kill Dana, he said. Everyone knew that the person really responsible was Emily Lauenborg. The same Emily that just so happened to be Amanda's best friend. That wasn't all, though. You see, Emily also had a nickname that turned out to be of great interest to investigators. She was known as the Mutant because people said that she was freakishly strong for her size. Like Amanda, Emily Lauenborg was 17 years old and had been part of the so-called park rats. And as Amanda's best friend, there was no question that she had spent plenty of time with Dana Laskowski. Initially, authorities had doubts that she could be capable of a crime this sinister. However, that began to change as more and more people started to confirm the rumors they were hearing. It turned out that even amongst a group with a specific reputation for getting into trouble, Emily stood out. Other park rats told detectives that they were scared of her and that she was known for taking a lot of drugs and acting recklessly. They had nicknamed her the Mutant because she was stronger than any of the other girls they knew and wasn't afraid to get into serious fights. During these confrontations, it also apparently wasn't uncommon for her to use wrestling moves. Chillingly, a favorite maneuver of hers was a chokehold that involved putting one arm behind a victim's back and trying to turn them over at the waist. When detectives heard this, it sounded eerily similar to the position in which Dana had been found. When authorities brought Emily in for questioning, they found her uncooperative and arrogant. She dismissed all of the information that detectives presented her with, insisting that everyone who had provided statements about her was a liar. Though investigators tried to proceed with the interview, they soon realized that they weren't getting anywhere. Emily dodged any relevant questions and appeared more interested in playing games with detectives. Despite the fruitless interview, investigators were able to obtain a warrant to search Emily's residence. It would lead them to two unbelievable discoveries. The first was a black blouse which they were able to show had been taken from Dana Laskowski's home. Disturbingly, they soon learned that Emily had actually worn this same blouse to Dana's funeral. The next find, a diary belonging to Emily, was even more unsettling. There were two entries in particular that caught the attention of detectives. The first was a list titled 10 Things I Want to Do Before I Die. Number 9 on that list read, quote, "Kill someone and get away with it." The second entry was part of a chilling rant about her best friend Amanda. Part of it stated, quote, "I could strangle that bitch just like her aunt." Knowing that this evidence was likely as close to a confession as they were going to get, at this point, detectives decided to move ahead with the case against Emily Lauenborg. She was charged with first-degree murder. One question still remained, though. Why had she killed Dana Laskowski? Though authorities were now confident they had the right suspect, there were two major issues facing them. First, none of the physical evidence from their investigation had panned out, meaning that the entire case was circumstantial. Secondly, they still lacked a clear motive as to why the crime had happened in the first place. Hoping to reconcile these problems, detectives went to speak with Amanda one final time. This time around, they were extremely blunt. They said that they knew she had lied to them from the very beginning of their investigation, and that she was now looking at a charge of conspiracy after the fact if she didn't cooperate. This would be her last chance to tell the truth. That's when Amanda broke down and gave a horrifying confession. Amanda told investigators that on the night of the murder, she and Emily had shown up at her aunt's house high on drugs. After knocking at the back door, they had been let in by Dana as usual. Amanda said that they had only ever intended to ask for money, but out of nowhere, Emily had started being rude. She was saying things to her aunt that Amanda had never heard her say before, and continued to the point where Dana told them to leave. When Emily refused, Dana put a hand on her shoulder to motion her towards the door. It was at that point, Amanda claimed, that Emily flew into a full-blown rage. She grabbed Dana and placed her in a wrestling hold before grabbing a scarf or a piece of fabric which she wrapped around her neck. Amanda said that she turned around to avoid having to watch. She heard a crack, a gurgle, a few terrifying gasps, and then everything went quiet. After Dana was dead, Amanda said that she and Emily took as much money as they could find around the house and then fled, forgetting to close the back door behind them. Based on Amanda's confession, as well as other information found in Emily's diary, detectives were confident that they had finally filled in the rest of the missing pieces. They concluded that Emily was threatened by Amanda's relationship with her aunt. Though they had their doubts about whether she intended to commit a murder from the start that night, they theorized that at the very least Emily had intentionally been rude to try and bait Dana into an argument. The goal was to make it so that Amanda wasn't welcome there one way or another. When news of this horrifying revelation made its way to Dana's family, they were understandably shaken, especially by the news of Emily's motive. After all, since she and Amanda were best friends, Dana had been just as generous in caring with her as she had been with her niece. In the end, Dana had been betrayed by two people who she had treated like daughters. Unfortunately, the news would only get more tragic for Dana's family. Even with Amanda's agreement to testify against Emily in exchange for immunity, prosecutors thought taking the case to trial was risky. They feared that Amanda might still flip on the witness stand, leaving them with a circumstantial case that could go either way with a jury. Even if Amanda held up her end of the deal, given Emily's age and her unassuming demeanor, they worried that it would be tough to get a conviction. As a result, she was ultimately given a plea deal and was allowed to plead guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. On January 21st, 2004, she was sentenced to just 6.5 years in prison. Amanda, meanwhile, was never charged with any crime related to Dana's murder. This is one of those cases where it's really hard to feel like justice was done. That being said, it's also not clear that prosecutors were necessarily wrong for going the way that they did. In the past, we've covered our fair share of stories where it seems like plea deals were used as a matter of convenience rather than necessity. But in this case, I honestly can sort of see how a trial with so little hard evidence could have gone sideways and ended up with Emily walking. Don't get me wrong, though. Just because this is understandable does not mean that I'm saying it does anything to lessen the blow for Dana's loved ones, particularly her 3 children, who have had to grow up without a mother who so very clearly loved them more than anything in the world. In the statements we could find about the case from Dana's family members, they also seemed to express a mix of emotions. Initially, they seemed to have been happy that someone was at least being held accountable for the murder, though it's pretty obvious that they felt that the punishment was inadequate considering the magnitude of the crime. And I would tend to agree. At the time of this recording, Emily Lauenberg has long since left prison and has had the benefit of starting a new life. According to some sources, that life includes a marriage and children of her own. Meanwhile, Dana's family will never be whole again. I don't really know what else to say about that, other than it seems incredibly unfair. Hopefully, if nothing else though, Dana's loved ones can find some small comfort in the fact that she died doing what she truly believed in, opening her heart and her home to others in whatever way she could, regardless of whether or not they deserved it. Before we wrap up, we'd like to take a minute to thank our amazing supporters over on Patreon. As many of you are aware, our situation on YouTube always seems to be a bit uncertain, but our patrons help to ensure that we can continue to make content like this long term without having to worry as much about what surprises might be thrown our way. Plus, patrons also get access to 4 additional stories per week for each of our Crimes of the Week and Crimes of the Week International videos. If you'd like to help support the channel directly, head over to patreon.com/crimezone to join. You can also find that link in the description below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take care.